Good morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're all here with us today. I need to say a special word of thanks to Steve Schaffner, who last week, those of you who've been around for a while probably remember Steve, who with his daughter Stevie were part of our prayer team before his life took this other turn in it. And I hope you appreciated getting caught up with him and of course, the message he shared, but also just knowing that he's in good health. And that was a real joy for, I think, everyone to hear. I don't know if you noticed or not, but we had sort of bad weather the first couple months of this year. You know, it was snowy and a little cold and some of that stuff. But we, like probably every other church and lots of businesses, are suffering in terms of income as a result of that. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. And we can take your credit card or your debit card today if you just see Drew there in the back. So just wanted to let you know and just be aware that probably a lot of places are struggling a little bit more than normal because of the bad weather that seemed to go on and on and on and still doesn't seem to be over. At any rate, 2 weeks ago on the first Sunday of Lent, I mentioned to you that several of the Sunday's themes were coming from a book by Tom Stella entitled Finding God Beyond Religion. And that's very true of this morning's theme, which is about the church. Now, when he begins talking about the church, he talks about a letter he got from someone after a prior book was published. And he said that this woman shared with him her spiritual journey and kind of the struggles she was going through. And then she wrote these words: "I've never felt so close to God and so far from the church." First time I read that, I underlined it. I put exclamation points and a big star beside it because I could have written those very words. It seems that for me at least, the deeper my faith goes and the more alive and life-giving it becomes, the more distanced and alienated I feel from the church. It's as though I'm at odds with all of the trappings of institutional religion, and I'm also pretty disillusioned, disenchanted, disappointed in the church and some of its actions and some of what it's done or hasn't done. I mentioned those to you before, where very often the church seems to be observing the letter of the law and not the really spirit of love that Jesus showed and that Jesus portrayed. And I don't know if this is true, but I wonder if that perspective is not pretty prevalent in our society and may be contributing, or at least in part, to the decline of attendance in mainline denominations like this one, of which I'm a part. Now, there's a book that's been written that's entitled Unchristian. It's written by David Kinnaman and can't remember his first name, Gabe Lyons. And one of the things they talk about in this book is trying to appeal to younger generations. And they're saying that one of the things that younger people are appreciating is this transparency and vulnerability that some of our corporations and people in the business world are showing when they make a mistake or have a failure of one form or another. And that seems to be appealing to them. Well, a pastor in LA was really taken with this whole sense of transparency that he was seeing in the business community and decided the church needed some of that as well. So he and his team put together some postcards that they passed out on college campuses in the community and inviting them to come hear what he called Confessions of a Sinful Church. And he had 5 apologies that were listed on the card. He said, "We're sorry for our self-righteousness and hypocrisy. We're sorry for our endorsement of slavery. We're sorry for our mistreatment of homosexuals. We're sorry for the medieval crusades. We're sorry for saying the earth is flat." Now, I can't believe he could just limit it to 5 because I would have added a lot more to it. We're sorry for the oppression of women. We're sorry for the oppression of the poor. You know, the list could go on and on and on. But the things he names and others really fit in what Tom Stella referred to as a hardening of religious arteries, where it is so much about rules and dogmas and creeds, and not so much about people and love and hope. Well, that's pretty easy to say until we really think about what the church is. And if you ask anybody that's involved in the church what the basis for this organization we call the church is, they will point to this passage, that's our Bible passage, out of Matthew's gospel. Now, in this particular passage, we have the writer of the gospel assigning these words to Jesus, saying Jesus said this to one of his disciples, Peter. Let's look at it and then we'll talk about it a little bit. He said, "You are Peter, a rock. This is the rock upon which I will put together my church, a church so expansive with energy that not even the gates of hell will be able to keep it out." Now, I guess the first thing I need to say is I don't think Jesus said that. Now, there's a reason I don't think he said that. That's because Jesus was a Jew. He was born a Jew, he died a Jew. I think he was really about reforming and revitalizing the Judaism at the time. And it really wasn't his intention to start a new religion at all. Instead, I think he was really trying to help people. He challenged religion and trying to improve it and trying to bring something better to it. Now, the people who followed him, his disciples and others in later decades, became a part of what was called the Way, which is sort of the forerunner to what we call Christianity today. But they were the ones who actually tried to keep that sense of who Jesus was and what he was about alive and move it forward. Now, if you think about the fact that this gospel was written several decades after the death of Jesus, the writer of the gospel would have been aware of what was going on around him. And I think this is sort of part of his imagination, where this all came from. And, maybe he talked to somebody and they came up with this idea. I don't know how it happened. All I know is that this is the verse upon which the church is supposedly founded. That started with what we call the Catholic Church and certainly continued on for us. But I think we have to dig a little deeper here and think about what it's actually saying. If this, "You are Peter, the rock upon which I'm going to found my church." Let's think about what Peter was like, at least for starters. Now, I suppose whenever we read Scripture, you'll come up with opinions and perspectives on what these various followers of Jesus were. And I have mine about what I think of Peter. I thought he was pretty rambunctious and unpredictable. You remember, he's the one who said to Jesus, "You can count on me. I'll always be there for you no matter what." And yet he's the one who, after Jesus was arrested, denied that he knew him. Denied 3 times that he knew him. So I think what we see here with Peter is that he's just a plain old human being like you and like me, that we've sort of lifted up and elevated to some level of sainthood, I suppose. But I can only imagine that if this really did happen, if this activity happened, then I can only imagine how miffed the other disciples would be. I think, Peter, of all people, Peter, really? At any rate, I think the point is Peter's like us. He's human. And the church is people like us. It's not a building. It's not a location. It's you and it's me. We are the ones that come together to create what we call the church. And as human beings, we have weaknesses. We make mistakes. We're not perfect. And we have our challenges. We have our limitations. And yet, we're the ones who can carry the message of God's love out into this world. So I want us to think about, however imperfect it might be, what would it be like if we as the church lived more the way Jesus lived? Now, Quaker pastor and author Phil Gully has written a book about that very thing. He called it "If the Church Were Christian." And he names several different elements, categories, characteristics, I think, that he would name if the church really were Christian, as Jesus was a faithful person, and lived the way he lived his life. And I'm just going to choose 3 or 4 of them that I think that least resonated with me. And the very first thing he talks about, which I agree is important, is how we view Jesus. And he says that the church would be more Christian if it really saw Jesus as a model for how to live our lives rather than as an object for worship. His point was, if we see Jesus only as the reason for us to worship, the object of our worship, we get into thinking about it has to be just this way, and Jesus was just like this, and couldn't be anything different from that. And we think right, we think. But it doesn't impact our acting. where what Gully, I think, is trying to say is that somehow the life of Jesus ought to impact the way we live our lives. And so it has to do with how we live that's more important than what we think or what we can theologize about. So that's one of the primary points he makes, which I'll talk about more when we get to Jesus right before Easter. Another thing he talks about is the church would be more Christian if we were more about reconciliation and less about judgment. This is where the human condition really comes to play, because I think probably many of us are fairly quick to make a snap judgment about someone when we can't possibly know the whole story or know all of the details and know what's going on behind the scenes. And yet we're very prone to do that. This happens all too often in the church at times where without compassion, without care, people are condemned or cast out. I know people, and perhaps you do too, who were excluded from the fellowship of the church because they'd gone through a divorce. And that's a time when people need the love and support and encouragement more than any other time. And yet they were excluded and told they could no longer be a part. I know those in the GLBT community who don't believe that they have a place in the church, who have never felt welcomed or accepted as they are to be a part of the church. And in my mind, that's a real tragedy. Instead of judgment, I think we need to be about trying to look through the eyes of God and to see one another as God sees us. Because I believe God sees each one of us as people who are beloved, people who are precious, who are valued, people of worth, people of potential. And when God looks at us that way, I think that's a reason for us to try to look at others that way and be inclusive and welcoming to the very best of our ability. It helps us see the best in one another and really bring out the best in one another. There's yet another thing I think the church could be if it really lived more the kind of life that Jesus lived, or the church as us could be. And that is, we would be more welcoming. We would invite the questions and the struggles and the wondering and the wanderings, instead of always giving pat answers to complex and unanswered questions. The church doesn't really like to have its authority challenged very much. And sometimes that questioning that people bring can feel pretty threatening in one way or another. And I think at least, that those questions and those struggles may be one of the surest signs we have of being on a faith journey. Because you see, we only struggle with the things that we take seriously, the things that really matter to us, the things that make a difference to us. And I think it has a lot more integrity to ask questions than it does to just blindly and blandly accept what somebody else said or believed or thought centuries ago. If we want to make it our own, we have to really struggle and question and figure out what really does feel like real and like truth for us. And so I think that also means that we can't expect people to all look alike and that everybody's faith journey is going to be identical. We're all different people. We come from different backgrounds, have different experiences. And so every one of our journeys will be unique as we are unique. And so we don't have to fit into a mold and everybody look exactly the same way. I don't think that's necessary. And then there's another thing that Gully talks about that I agree with, and he says that the purpose of the church, the role of the church, is really to teach people to be more loving in this life, in this world, and not be worried so much about the next. Now, frankly, I've never been much into this being saved thing and to this quest for salvation for whatever comes next, the next world. More and more, I've gotten to the point of believing that how we live now, if we live a life that's loving and positive now, we don't need to worry about what comes next. It will take care of itself. And anyways, with God, God knows us. It'll be okay. I'm convinced of that. William Penn, the Quaker, said this: "True godliness does not turn men out of the world, men and women, but enables them to live better in it and excites their endeavors to mend it." And then Phil Gully said, "If the church were Christian, we would do what Jesus did, equip one another to live better in this world and stop fretting about the next one." Well, the church as it is now is imperfect. It has its flaws. It makes lots of mistakes. But yet I do believe that the church is one of the ways, at least, in which we connect with God. And when we connect with God, when we get a sense of God's love in our hearts, in our lives, then we can become people who share that love wherever we happen to be. That's the kind of church I want to be part of.